The radar that shouldn't have worked, but saved a nation. It began with a pulse so faint that most operators dismissed it as atmospheric clutter. A jitter on the recording paper. A narrow, disciplined frequency, threading through a band, usually filled with noise. No one expected anything unusual that night. Britain had learned to live with tension, but this signal was different. It had purpose, it had structure, and it was heading straight toward the heart of the country. In a small monitoring station north of London, technicians leaned over their equipment, unaware that they were witnessing the opening lines of a new chapter in air warfare. For months, Britain had struggled against night raids that seemed too coordinated to be random. But no one had been able to prove the existence of a guidance system. The Luftwaffe was dangerous, but not omniscient. At least that was the assumption. Yet on that night, the data refused to behave like random interference. It sharpened into a regular rhythm, a clean, unwavering tone, a line that cut across the noise floor like a blade. Only one man in the building reacted as if the incoming trace mattered. He was an engineer who'd spent too many nights staring at instruments others ignored. His instincts were shaped not by rank, but by pattern recognition, by the stubborn belief that every anomaly could be the beginning of something larger. He leaned in, adjusted the gain, and felt a jolt of certainty. This wasn't stray energy. This wasn't the atmosphere. This wasn't accidental. It was engineered. He began making rough calculations. Bearing, drift, phase stability. Everything about the signal contradicted peacetime assumptions about German radio capacity. If the source was what he suspected, then Germany had just revealed a capability capable of reshaping the air war. He logged the numbers, cross-checked them, and caught a detail that made his chest tighten. The signal was angled in a way that suggested long-range targeting, not communication. A line so precise that it could only come from a highly directional transmitter, one that shouldn't have existed at that range. If he was right, the Luftwaffe had found a way to reach British cities with accuracy that defied darkness, weather, and standard navigation errors. A silent corridor carved through the night sky. He requested confirmation from a second station. Their reading matched his, then a third. The line held steady. No drift, no flutter, no sign of natural fluctuation, only intent. The engineer watched as new pulses began overlaying the main frequency, short markers that did not match any known German communication pattern. They appeared at fixed intervals, as if counting down to something. These weren't messages, they were coordinates. That was the moment he understood it. Germany wasn't guiding airplanes by guesswork anymore. They were building invisible paths. They were constructing beams. And the beam on his screen was already pointed at a British industrial corridor. The realization landed with the weight of a falling bomb. This wasn't preparation. It was execution. He documented everything, his handwriting tightening with urgency. As he did, the signal suddenly shifted. Not gradually, not as a technical fade. It snapped 3 kilohertz upward, clean, deliberate, mechanical. Someone, somewhere on the German coast, had just thrown a switch, and the line on his panel realigned into an even sharper beam. The engineer stared at the new pattern, knowing exactly what it meant but unable to say it aloud. Germany had just activated a system Britain didn't understand, and the first target was already chosen. That night, the British command still slept. The radar rooms hummed quietly. The operators rotated their shifts with routine discipline. Only one man grasped that something unprecedented had entered the war. Only one man understood that he had just seen the beginning of a new kind of attack, a kind Britain had no defense for. And the signal on his panel had only just begun. He arrived before dawn, long before the corridors of the ministry filled with the usual shuffle of boots and clipped conversations. The building's stone walls still held the night's cold, and the air tasted of stale paper and machinery oil. He moved quickly, carrying the log sheets he had written only hours earlier, evidence that he already suspected would be met with disbelief. The engineer was not part of the upper circles of command. He had no medals to his name, no decades of seniority, no seat at the polished tables where decisions were made. What he did have was a rare combination of patience, training, and an almost obsessive interest in radio anomalies. He knew the difference between drifting static and deliberate modulation. He had spent years studying signals that most operators ignored: irregular bursts, narrow spikes, fading harmonics. To him, patterns spoke louder than orders. His colleagues respected his precision, but many quietly considered him a man who pushed too hard into theories that didn't matter. A man who chased signals that couldn't possibly signify something larger. A man too willing to assume Germany was running ahead of British expectations. But in wartime, breakthroughs often came from those who refused to stay in line. He reached his office, flicked on the lamp, and spread the sheets across the desk. The traces he had collected the night before still seemed unreal. They were too clean, too sharply defined. A signal that stable should not have been possible at that distance, not without a transmitter far more advanced than anything Germany had publicly deployed. The consistency alone suggested an antenna system of unusual sophistication. He began cross-referencing the bearing with known German installations. The nearest registered station capable of reaching Britain operated on a different frequency. Another one lacked the equipment necessary to produce a beam this narrow. He checked records twice, then a third time. None matched the characteristics of the signal, which meant the transmitter was either unlisted, recently upgraded, or deliberately disguised. He paused at the third possibility. Disguised. Germany had always been meticulous in masking its infrastructure. But creating a long-range precision beam required equipment that couldn't simply be hidden in a shed. It demanded tall masts, large antenna arrays, and a continuous power supply. A system like that left footprints, engineering footprints. And yet, Britain had no photographs, no reports, no intercepted construction logs. He felt the familiar unease of discovering something that shouldn't exist. He pulled out earlier intelligence files, interviews with captured pilots, fragments from crashed aircraft, intercepted communications. Most of it seemed routine, but scattered among the pages were a few ambiguous phrases that now struck him as significant. Training flights along lines, strict altitude requirements, course, drift not permitted. None of these lines had stood out before. Now they formed a thread. He followed it. One pilot had mentioned signals that hum when aligned. Another had been overheard complaining about a tone that disappears if you stray. At the time, these comments were treated as quirks of cockpit equipment. But the engineer saw something different. If German crews were being trained to fly according to tones, steady, repeating, unmistakable tones, it meant Germany had created a system simple enough for any pilot to use and accurate enough to guide entire bomber groups. He knew how dangerous that would be in the hands of a country that had already demonstrated its willingness to strike at night, through cloud cover, across open water. And now the evidence suggested that this system was not a concept, not a prototype, but already operational. He leaned back, feeling the weight of the conclusion settling on him. Britain had prepared for an enemy that navigated by dead reckoning and visual cues. Britain had not prepared for an enemy guided by invisible corridors drawn across the sky. He returned to the signal logs. The shift that had occurred in the final moments of the night still bothered him. It was too abrupt to be accidental. It indicated a system capable of reconfiguration, fast, precise, remote. That kind of agility required a level of engineering that none of Britain's analysts had anticipated. That meant the Luftwaffe could change targets with minimal preparation. Factories, shipyards, rail hubs, anything marked by the crossing of those beams could be struck with unnerving accuracy. He made notes as fast as he could, condensing calculations into plain language. He knew the difficulty wouldn't be proving the math. It would be convincing men who trusted their preconceptions more than his warnings. Men who believed Germany was bound by the same limitations Britain had faced at the start of the war. He organized the sheets into a single packet and stood up. The hall was beginning to fill with footsteps, conversation, the daily rhythm of a nation under pressure. He knew what awaited him. Skepticism, perhaps irritation, perhaps another reminder not to overinterpret anomalies. But he also knew he was the only one who had connected these fragments into a coherent threat. He stepped into the corridor, carrying the packet that could redefine Britain's understanding of the enemy. As he reached the stairs, a runner from another monitoring station arrived, breathless, clutching a fresh message. A new signal had been detected, and this one was stronger. The runner's message contained only a few lines, but they were enough to shift the engineer's mourning from urgency to alarm. A second station, one far outside the usual intercept grid, had captured a frequency identical to the one he had recorded just hours earlier. Same tone, same stability, same impossible precision. But there was one difference. The bearing pointed to a completely different sector of the German coast. He read the report twice, then a third time, checking for clerical error. The numbers held. If both stations were correct, and he trusted the operators who sent those readings, then Germany wasn't operating a single experimental transmitter. There were at least two, possibly more. That realization carried consequences far beyond any late-night anomaly. One transmitter could be dismissed as a special test. Two hinted at a coordinated system, a network capable of shaping the course of entire bombing operations. He took the message to his office, locking the door behind him. On the map pinned to the wall, he marked both bearings with careful strokes. The lines cut across the North Sea at slightly different angles, each pointed toward industrial zones, port facilities, railway junctions. The overlap region was dense with targets. Too dense to be coincidence. He drew the lines again, this time calculating how a German bomber would perceive them. If an aircraft followed the first beam, it would travel along a predictable path. If a second beam crossed that path, the intersection would serve as a trigger point, a reference for release, a point where navigation shifted from estimate to certainty. A network of intersecting beams could guide bombers with unprecedented accuracy. He stepped back and studied the map. The pattern was too structured to dismiss, too deliberate to ignore. He opened a file drawer and removed a thin folder containing fragments retrieved from a German aircraft shot down months earlier. At the time, the equipment had been classified as routine radio gear, but now, examined through a different lens, its features raised questions. A narrow-band filter built to withstand long exposure, unexpectedly fine calibration screws, a coil arrangement that favored directionality rather than simple communication. The equipment now looked less like cockpit radio and more like airborne guidance receivers. He flipped through the pages of the crash report, stopping at a photograph he had overlooked before. It showed a small metal bracket mounted near the receiver housing, aligned at a specific angle. At the time, no one could explain its purpose, but now he recognized it instantly. It was a mechanical alignment aid used to keep an antenna array oriented toward a narrow external source. The device had been hiding in plain sight. He felt a pulse of anger, not at the crews who recovered it, but at the countless assumptions that had blinded them. Britain had built its wartime analysis around the idea that Germany would think like Britain, innovate like Britain, and limit itself to the same constraints. But Germany had moved past conventional navigation months ago. Their engineers had invested in tools specifically designed to overcome night, fog, and coastal distance. Britain, meanwhile, had been preparing to fight yesterday's war. He pushed aside the crash reports and returned to the night's new intercept. The second signal, this one stronger, showed a distinct pattern of pulses layered over the main tone. The spacing between them was regular, shorter than communication bursts, but more structured than static. He measured the intervals and found a startling consistency. Each pulse occurred at a fixed time displacement relative to the carrier. That meant the signal wasn't just a beam, it was encoded. Not in any cryptographic sense, but in a functional way, a method to help the receiver determine exactly where it stood within the beam's footprint, a technique that allowed the pilot to correct drift in real time. He realized he was staring at an innovation that could neutralize one of the fundamental weaknesses of night bombing, the tendency of aircraft to wander off course without visual reference. With this layered modulation, the pilot didn't need stars or coastline. He didn't need guesses or dead reckoning. He only needed the tone. He examined the waveform on the printed trace from the second station. The line was firm, unwavering, almost unnatural in its clarity. No civilian broadcaster could sustain a signal like this. It was military, purpose-built, and backed by equipment Britain had not anticipated. He marked the trace with notes: stability beyond expectation, harmonics suppressed, phase noise minimal. Everything about it contradicted the assumption that Germany lagged behind in radio engineering. He sat down, realizing the implications reached further than he had imagined. If Germany had perfected long-range beam guidance, the Luftwaffe could choose targets deep inside Britain with accuracy that defied traditional defense planning. Entire raids could be designed around invisible corridors the British did not yet know how to detect, let alone disrupt. As he reviewed the evidence, he noticed something he had missed, something that made the hairs on his neck rise. The stronger signal showed a slight oscillation every few seconds. At first glance, it looked like interference, but the regularity of the movement betrayed a different cause. The transmitter was shifting its beam minutely, as if sweeping across a range before locking onto a final heading. That meant the transmitter was adjustable. It could be aimed, quickly, precisely, remotely. This wasn't simply a fixed beacon. It was a weaponized instrument of navigation. He checked the time logs and realized that the sweep occurred shortly before the frequency upshift he had observed the night before. Someone in Germany was calibrating the beam, testing its reach, ensuring its precision, and the timing of the adjustment suggested the calibration was complete. They were ready. He gathered the sheets, placed them into a new folder, and prepared his notes for the officials who still doubted such a system was possible. He knew he would need every calculation, every trace, every scrap of logic to convince them. But before he could leave, another message arrived from a coastal station. A new bearing had been recorded. The third signal was even cleaner, and this one pointed directly toward a city no one had believed to be in immediate danger. The third signal arrived with a clarity that stripped away any lingering doubts. The coastal station that captured it was equipped with older instruments, devices known for drift, for slight distortions, for readings that needed careful correction. Yet the line on their paper strip appeared as sharp as if drawn by a metal ruler. No haze, no jitter, no sign of natural fading. A signal that clean could only come from a powerful transmitter operating with extreme discipline. The engineer spread the new sheet beside the two from earlier stations. Each trace pointed in a slightly different direction, but when plotted on the map, all lines converged across the industrial heart of Britain. Not vaguely, not approximately. They formed a geometric corridor, an invisible airway Germany had carved through the night sky. The implications were stark. 3 beams meant structure. 3 bearings meant coordination. The Luftwaffe was not navigating by chance. They were preparing something that demanded absolute control. He pinned the map to the board and marked each intercept with fast, neat strokes. Behind him, the corridor outside his office filled with the sounds of the day accelerating. Footsteps, messages being passed, hand to hand, the distant hum of radio sets coming online. Britain was bracing for more raids, but few understood how advanced the threat had become. He returned to the fragments retrieved from German aircraft months earlier, pieces dismissed at the time as technical oddities. A coil housing with unusually tight tolerances, a dial etched with calibration marks finer than typical cockpit instruments, and, most telling, a small transformer with shielding far thicker than anything used for ordinary communication. He examined the shielding again. It was designed to protect the internal circuit from fluctuating field strength. That kind of protection was unnecessary for voice or Morse transmission. But for guidance signals, signals that had to remain pure, steady, unmistakable, the shielding was essential. Germany had not accidentally stumbled into advanced navigation. They had engineered it. He pulled out interrogation reports from captured pilots. Most contained routine descriptions of procedures, routes, and tactics. Yet a few lines stood out now that he knew what to look for. A pilot had mentioned that the tone never wavers unless you betray it. Another described course lines that seemed to run into the darkness and never end. At the time, those statements read like exaggerations or misunderstandings from flyers under stress. Now they read like clues Britain had missed. He sorted through technical notes collected from a crashed bomber recovered near the coast. One sheet showed wear marks on metal fixtures inside the cockpit, small grooves near a box mounted at shoulder height. The positioning made little sense for standard radio sets, which were usually placed lower for easy access. But if the device was meant to deliver continuous audio feedback, a guiding tone the pilot needed to monitor at all times, then it had to be close to ear level. Piece by piece, a picture formed. The Luftwaffe had built a cockpit environment around beam-guided flight. He laid out the 3 bearing lines again. A pattern emerged. One transmitter placed near the edge of the German coastline, another deeper inland, and a third positioned to sweep across the sea at a complementary angle. This meant Germany had invested heavily in ground infrastructure. Tall masts, high-powered generators, antenna arrays capable of shaping energy into tight, consistent beams. Britain's reconnaissance flights had photographed several German installations over the past months, but analysts believed they were standard communication towers. Now it was evident they were far more than that. He circled an area on the German coast where the third beam might originate and studied intelligence files. One report described an unusual construction site near a fishing village. Another mentioned locals being relocated without explanation. None of this proved the existence of a beam station, but the pattern was unmistakable, remote, secure, close to open water. Ideal for long-range transmission. He drafted a memo requesting updated aerial reconnaissance over the region. He knew the request might be denied. Aircraft were already stretched thin. But without photographs, Britain would remain blind to the scale of the German network. The engineer then returned to the new intercept. A detail caught his eye. An amplitude shift that occurred at regular intervals. It was subtle, almost hidden in the clean carrier, but when magnified, it showed a repeating cycle. The modulation could indicate distance markers or correction cues, guiding pilots not only along the corridor, but also preparing them for a precise point where the beam crossed another. That changed everything. A single beam could guide a straight-line approach. Multiple beams could create a grid. A grid allowed pinpoint targeting. In night bombing, where pilots usually dropped explosives based on estimates, guesswork, and flashes below, grid-based navigation transformed probability into near certainty. He began calculating where the intersecting beams would form their strongest convergence. The answer appeared within minutes. One of the largest industrial cities in Britain lay directly at the crossing point. A city critical to aircraft production. A city heavily defended, yet vulnerable if the enemy could approach without visual detection. He circled the city on the map. The pencil line felt heavier than the rest. For the first time, he understood Germany's intent. These beams were not simply experiments, nor were they random tests. They were the framework for a strategic assault, one that could cripple Britain's war industry with a level of precision never seen before. He prepared to take his findings to the officials, who still doubted the threat. But before he could leave, a coded internal message arrived in his inbox. It came from a small RAF station that rarely reported anything significant. They had detected a pattern unlike the first 3 signals. A shorter beam, sharper, aligned with the different part of the coastline. And it appeared to be adjusting, as if searching for something. The new intercept from the RAF outpost was shorter than the others. Its beam narrower, its tone sharper, its behavior unlike the previous signals the engineer had mapped. This one did not hold steady. It searched. Every few seconds, it shifted by a fraction of a degree, as if sweeping across a small arc and then returning to center. A controlled mechanical oscillation. It resembled a lighthouse, only invisible and far more precise. He pinned the latest recording beside the others on the board. The difference was immediately obvious. The first beams were long, stable corridors intended for guiding aircraft across the sea. This new one was different in character and purpose. It seemed designed not for distance, but for refinement, for final adjustments near a target. A correction beam. If Germany had built a layered system, long beams for approach, narrow ones for calibration, the accuracy of their bombing could exceed anything Britain had prepared for. He returned to the fragments taken from the German crash site. Most of what had been recovered was routine, but one component had been noted by the salvage team as peculiar. It was a small metal frame holding 2 parallel lengths of wire, spaced at an unusual interval. At first glance, it resembled a damaged antenna, but the spacing between the wires was too precise, the angle too deliberate. He retrieved the fragment and examined it under a lamp. The wires were mounted on a bracket that allowed slight rotation, only a few degrees. Enough to align with a narrow beam. Enough to distinguish left of center from right of center reception. Enough to help a pilot stay on track, even when weather made instruments difficult to read. It wasn't a broken part. It was a beam-following guide. The engineer photographed the wires and added them to a growing folder of clues. The German system, once assumed to be theoretical at best, was revealing its design element by element. A main transmitter to establish direction. A secondary transmitter to confirm position. Now, possibly, a tertiary beam meant to complete the chain, ensuring the bomber reached a precise drop point. Germany wasn't improvising. They were executing a plan. He sat down and sketched how these components might work together. Long-range guidance, course alignment, final correction. A 3-stage process, elegant in its simplicity, devastating in its effectiveness. He checked the timing of each intercept. The first beam had activated just after midnight. The second, roughly 1 hour later. The third, only minutes after that. The progression suggested testing. Systematic, controlled, deliberate. Each new signal fit into a broader architecture. He reached for intelligence files on German engineering firms known for radio equipment. One name appeared repeatedly in procurement records. Lorenz. They were known for their work on blind landing systems for civilian aircraft before the war. Systems that guided pilots in poor visibility. The engineer paused. Germany had not invented beam navigation from scratch. They had repurposed and militarized a technology they already knew intimately. He made a note to request deeper analysis of pre-war German civil aviation patents. Somewhere in those papers, he suspected, were clues Britain had overlooked. Antenna arrangements, modulation patterns, ground station architecture. Britain had assumed Germany's technology had plateaued. Instead, it had evolved under the cover of civilian advancement. He pulled the third intercept report closer. Its regular sweep intrigued him. He measured the sweep range and plotted it onto the map. The arc covered a small industrial district near a major rail junction, a place where locomotive parts were manufactured and shipped across the country. A strategic choke point. If the beam was indeed a final correction transmitter, then Germany was preparing to test not only long-range guidance, but also precision calibration on a specific slice of Britain's infrastructure. He checked the harmonic profile on the recording. The signal was strikingly clean. Harmonics were suppressed to the point of near invisibility. That level of purity required a transmitter array with exceptional tuning. Likely a specialized antenna system built for directional control. He flipped through reconnaissance photographs taken along the German coast. Most images showed shipping lanes, coastal batteries, radar outposts. But one photograph captured his attention, a set of tall vertical masts arranged in a straight line, each separated by an identical distance. The caption listed them as probable communication masts. The spacing told him otherwise. They were arrayed in a formation optimized for directional focus. A parasitic array, a configuration that could shape outgoing radio energy into a narrow, powerful beam capable of reaching Britain with minimal spread. He circled the photograph and pinned it beside the intercept sheet. The connection was unmistakable. Germany had built a long-range beam station using advanced antenna architecture, concealed in plain sight under the guise of ordinary communications. They had not only solved the technical challenges, they had hidden their solution behind the assumptions of their enemies. He documented everything for the briefing he knew he had to deliver, this time with more urgency than before. Every new discovery narrowed the window Britain had to respond. As he prepared his notes, a message arrived from the Coastal Monitoring Unit. The sweeping beam they had logged earlier had stopped shifting. The oscillation was gone. The signal had locked into a fixed position. The Germans had finished adjusting it, and the beam was now pointed directly at a British rail junction essential to the nation's war production. By the time the sun set that evening, the narrow beam near the rail junction had held its position for nearly 3 hours. The signal did not waver. It did not drift. It behaved as if someone had anchored it to an invisible hinge in the sky. The engineer interpreted the stability for what it was. Germany had completed its alignment phase. The corridor was ready for use. He walked the length of the operations floor at the ministry, listening to the steady hum of wireless sets, the tapping of keys, the clipped exchanges between duty officers. The daily rhythm masked the fact that Britain was standing on the edge of something it had not faced before, an enemy capable of designing its air attacks with scientific precision. He reached the intelligence room, where a team was already compiling reports of German aircraft movement. Radar stations along the coast had logged activity unusual for a weekday night. Small clusters of aircraft rising from airfields near the Dutch and Belgian borders, not large enough to trigger an immediate alarm, but too coordinated to be dismissed as training flights. He gathered the intercept sheets and pinned them to a larger map. The long-range beams from the previous night cut across the map like invisible rails. The shorter, newly stabilized beam pointed to a manufacturing district that had not seen significant bombing in weeks. He checked the position again. The coordinates matched exactly with a locomotive works facility, one of the few in Britain capable of producing heavy engine components at scale. Destroying it would not merely damage production. It would slow troop transport, hinder material distribution, and strain supply lines across the nation. The engineer requested updated reconnaissance from the coastal radar outposts. Minutes later, a report arrived confirming multiple aircraft now flying toward the North Sea. They maintained tight formation at moderate altitude, consistent with bombers preparing for a night approach. What troubled him most was not their route, but the timing. The flight paths aligned almost perfectly with the long-range beam he had charted earlier. He entered the briefing room where senior officers were gathered. Charts covered the table. Coffee cups sat untouched. The room smelled of stress, paper, dust, cigarette smoke. He laid out his findings in calm, precise steps. The progression of signals, the alignment behavior, the beam stability, the likely target. At first, the atmosphere remained tense but skeptical. Senior officers questioned whether the signals might represent routine German testing. Others wondered whether bad weather might force the bombers to turn back. Britain had endured months of raids. Another attack seemed inevitable, but not remarkable. Then he placed the latest intercept in front of them. The stabilized correction beam pointed at the locomotive works. A few leaned forward. Others narrowed their eyes. There was no denying the targeting pattern now. The Germans had drawn their path, marked their endpoint, and settled their guidance. A strike was coming. Some in the room wanted to respond aggressively, deploy fighters, activate anti-aircraft batteries at full strength, jam every frequency even remotely connected to the beams. But none of them understood how dependent Britain had become on the secrecy surrounding its monitoring capabilities. If Germany realized the British were reading their beams, they would adjust immediately. Worse, they would develop a system Britain might not detect until it was too late. Britain needed to defend itself carefully, but discreetly. The engineer recommended a targeted response. Reposition a limited number of anti-aircraft units to cover the probable bombing route, reinforce nighttime observation posts, and prepare rapid emergency crews near the junction. Enough to reduce casualties, not enough to reveal foreknowledge. The officers deliberated, weighing consequences under pressure. No one liked the idea of sparing resources. No one liked the idea of holding back. But the engineer's logic was irrefutable. The Luftwaffe's confidence in its beams had become its greatest vulnerability. Britain had to exploit that without tipping its hand. As they finalized their reduced response plan, another message arrived from the coastal radar network. The formations had crossed the Dutch coastline and were heading toward open water. Their altitude was steady, their speed consistent with Heinkel or Junkers bombers. The pattern matched operations that had preceded heavy night raids earlier in the war. The strike was now in motion. The engineer returned to his map. The beams were still active. He checked the time between pulses and noticed a small but significant change. The correction beam's amplitude was rising by a fraction. It was a subtle increase, too small for inexperienced operators to notice, but it meant the German transmitter was boosting power. He knew what that meant. The attackers were getting closer. The beam had shifted from calibration mode to operational mode. As the room filled with reports and the air grew heavier, the engineer recognized the shape of the moment. This was not a rehearsal. It was not a threat on paper. It was the first real demonstration of a weapon Germany believed was unstoppable. Britain had only hours to see whether it truly was. He reached for one last intercept sheet, intending to double-check the bearing, when the lights flickered briefly, a reminder of the nation's fragility under strain. Then a new message from the Coastal Watch came through. A fourth signal had appeared, stronger than the correction beam, tighter than the long-range guides. And unlike the others, it was pulsing at a rate meant for timing, not navigation. Whatever Germany was preparing, this new beam was the final piece. The fourth signal did not resemble the others. It was leaner, faster, and carried a rhythm that suggested intention rather than alignment. The engineer examined the intercept closely, running his finger along the printed trace. Instead of a steady carrier or a sweeping calibration tone, this one produced evenly spaced bursts, short, clipped impulses arranged with mechanical discipline. These were timing markers. If the first beams directed the bombers and the correction beam refined their course, this new signal told them when they would reach the decisive point, a synchronizing pulse, the kind of cue that allowed a pilot, even in complete darkness, to prepare for the moment when navigation ceded to execution. The engineer felt the weight of the discovery settle in. Germany was not just guiding aircraft, it was orchestrating them. Layer upon layer of radio architecture, each segment serving a singular purpose. What Britain had previously assumed were random German innovations were now revealed as components of a tightly integrated system. He spread the signal sheets across the table in chronological order. First, the long-range beams stretching across the North Sea. Then the correction transmitter locking onto a specific district. And now the timing pulses, layered with surgical precision. The sequence was unmistakable. A coordinated raid was about to unfold with mathematical accuracy. Before he could document the full analysis, a messenger entered the operations room with an urgent note. He opened it. The content confirmed what he feared. Radar stations on the southeast coast detected a growing formation of aircraft approaching in staggered waves. They were still distant, but their trajectory matched the line of the primary beam. The Luftwaffe was on schedule. He moved quickly to a lower-level monitoring center, where operators huddled over receivers. The atmosphere was tense but controlled. Charts were updated in real time. Bearings were plotted as fast as pencils could be sharpened. Britain had grown accustomed to nighttime incursions, but this one carried a quality of precision that no one could deny once the signals were laid alongside the radar tracks. The engineer stood behind an operator who was monitoring the new timing pulses. The pulses arrived with striking regularity, each separated by the same number of milliseconds. He cross-referenced the timing interval with expected flight speeds of German bombers at the altitude detected by radar. The match was unsettlingly close. He measured again. There was no possibility of coincidence. The pulses functioned like signposts in the sky, giving crews the ability to estimate distance to the final beam crossing point. It meant the Luftwaffe could release bombs without relying on visual confirmation or dead reckoning. The devastation Germany could now deliver was no longer a matter of chance. It was planned into the architecture of their radio network. Report after report came in from listening posts along the coast. Operators at different stations were hearing the same pulse pattern. That alone confirmed the strength of the transmitter. It had to be powerful, elevated, and highly directional. The engineer returned to the reconnaissance photograph of the mysterious row of German masts. This was likely their source. He folded the photo and placed it inside his notes. At some point, Britain would have to neutralize that site. But tonight, there was no time to think about future countermeasures. Tonight, the raid was unfolding. The bomber formations approached the midpoint of the long-range beam. Radar indicated the clusters tightening, as if the crews were adjusting their positions. The engineer knew why, but they were aligning themselves with the invisible corridor he had mapped earlier. The thought that hundreds of aircraft could ride a silent, unseen guide across an entire sea raised a chilling question. If Germany had perfected this system, what else had they developed that Britain had not yet detected? He forced the thought aside and returned to the pulses. A slight variation caught his attention, a faint secondary peak shadowing each main pulse. The secondary peak was not strong enough to matter to the untrained eye, but its presence suggested a modulation overlay, something intentionally inserted. He magnified the trace by adjusting the gain. The secondary peaks formed a pattern of their own. 3 short shadows followed every 9th pulse. He measured the spacing. Then again. A coded distance cue. Even if cockpit equipment were slightly misaligned, even if the main tone fluctuated due to weather or altitude changes, the secondary shadows would help the pilot anticipate the final trigger point. Germany was building redundancy into its guidance network. These were not improvisations made under pressure. They were refinements made by engineers who understood the complexities of long-range navigation. He drafted an emergency brief and prepared to deliver it to senior command, when a shout rose from the far corner of the monitoring room. An operator waved him over. The new radar sweep showed the bomber formation splitting into two groups. One continued along the main beam. The other veered slightly south. The engineer checked the beam alignment charts. The southern group was moving toward a secondary intersection point he had identified, but hoped would remain unused. If they hit both targets, the primary locomotive works and the secondary rail interchange, the damage would compound across the entire transport network. Britain could not afford the loss of even one of these sites, let alone both. He stepped back from the radar screen, realizing the Luftwaffe was using the full breadth of its layered beam system. They weren't simply aiming for one city. They were assigning different groups to different beam lines, each guided by the architecture he had only just uncovered. A two-pronged precision strike. He raced to update his notes, preparing to alert command of the multiple target threat. But before he reached the door, a fresh intercept arrived from a northern monitoring post. It did not match any of the beams he had charted. It was on a new frequency, clean, disciplined, unmistakably German. And it was pointed toward a region Britain had believed was outside the immediate danger zone. The new frequency from the northern post came in clean. Too clean for an auxiliary transmitter, too steady for a mobile unit. The engineer held the paper strip beneath the lamp, studying the line with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years decoding structure inside chaos. The frequency was higher than the others, its carrier narrower, its stability remarkable. This was not part of the long-range grid. It was something else entirely. He marked the bearing with a precise stroke and traced the line across the map. It cut diagonally through the eastern coastline, bypassing the industrial centers already under threat. At first it appeared unrelated, but when he extended the line further inland, it intersected a region that had largely escaped heavy bombardment, an inland manufacturing district known for producing specialized machine tools. These tools were essential for aircraft engine production. Damaging this region would not create firestorms, but it would choke the flow of precision components needed at every RAF repair depot in the country. He reviewed earlier German reconnaissance flights. A few had passed over the area weeks ago, too high to gather detailed imagery, too brief to suggest immediate interest. At the time, analysts dismissed them. Now, with the beam plotted across the map, they gained new meaning. Germany had not forgotten the region. They had catalogued it. He added the new bearing to the cluster of other signals. A pattern emerged, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The beams were not random. They formed a geometric lattice, a series of invisible corridors linking distant points. Each beam had a role: the long-range guides, the correction lines, the timing pulses. And now this. An inland vector that could support a secondary or tertiary strike. The Luftwaffe had built something Britain had not anticipated, a radio-based map of the British mainland. He stepped back from the board, realizing the psychological gravity of the discovery. The Germans were not choosing targets instinctively. They were choosing them mathematically. With every shift of a dial on their coastal transmitters, they could draw a new path to a new target, all without exposing their aircraft to unnecessary risk. Britain was facing an enemy whose weapons were not only mechanical, but architectural. He spread out the new intercept sheet and began analyzing the waveform. Unlike the earlier beams, this one carried a subtle amplitude imbalance between its left and right sides, a hallmark of direction-finding systems. Pilots could determine their exact lateral position based on which side produced a stronger signal. If they drifted left, the tone sharpened. If they drifted right, it softened. He recognized the principle immediately, a variant of the dot-dash modulation used in pre-war blind landing systems. Germany had taken a civilian safety tool and extended it far beyond its intended purpose. He scribbled notes quickly, translating mathematical relationships into practical conclusions. A pilot flying toward the inland district would receive unmistakable audio guidance all the way to the target, even if cloud cover swallowed the ground and searchlights failed to find their mark. The modulation meant the beam was designed to be flown by crews with minimal additional training. Ease of use was part of the weapon. He pulled additional reconnaissance photographs from the shelf, images taken along the German coastline by high-altitude RAF flights. One photograph captured a cluster of low buildings surrounded by tall, thin structures spaced in a precise formation. Analysts had labeled them as commercial radio towers. He examined the photograph closely. The antenna spacing appeared deliberate. The alignment suggested directional broadcasting capability, and the structure in the center, a squat concrete bunker, looked nothing like a commercial building. It resembled a transmitter control station. He circled the photograph and pinned it to the board. Germany had built a network of purpose-made beam transmitters across its coastline. Not one, not two, many. He returned to the inland beam plotted on the map and compared it with the timing pulses from the night before. The calculations suggested the inland beam had been activated after the primary formation split, but before radar confirmed the two-pronged approach. The sequence revealed intent. The Germans had designed a fallback or secondary target, using the inland transmitter as a backup in case weather, resistance, or mechanical issues disrupted the main operation. It meant the Luftwaffe was prepared to adapt mid-mission, something Britain had not expected in nighttime bombing. He documented the finding with growing urgency. If Germany could pivot targets seamlessly through its beam network, then Britain's defense assumptions, based on predicting likely targets, were outdated. The engineer drafted a memo urging the rapid expansion of listening posts across northern England. Without a wider net, Britain would always remain behind the curve. As he compiled his notes, a report came from a central monitoring hub. Operators had detected faint harmonics on the inland beam's frequency. At first glance, the harmonics appeared to be interference, but when viewed with a high-gain setting, they showed a consistent ripple pattern. He magnified the trace. The harmonics formed a small V-shaped dip every few seconds. He recognized the pattern instantly. A crossbeam, a second, perpendicular signal, too weak to detect directly, was interacting with the inland beam. The two together created a reference point in the sky, a drop point. Germany had just established a fully operational grid over a part of Britain the Defense Command had not even considered vulnerable. He placed the intercept down slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. The Luftwaffe had built something far more refined than previously imagined. Not a single guidance line, not an accidental discovery, but a system designed to target multiple cities, multiple regions, multiple industries, all with the turn of a dial. Before he could deliver the findings to command, another alert sounded in the monitoring center. A bomber formation, larger than the first two groups, had just crossed the Dutch coast, and it was flying directly toward the inland beam. The inland bomber group hadn't yet crossed the coast, but the radar tracks drew a clear path toward the beam the engineer had identified. He watched the markers glide across the plotting table in a slow, relentless arc. It was a deliberate formation, tight spacing, synchronized altitude, the kind of discipline that signaled confidence. The Luftwaffe trusted its beams. That trust made the situation more dangerous, and paradoxically, more exploitable. He stepped away from the table and gathered the notes he had prepared over the previous days. Britain could not dismantle the German beam network overnight. It could not destroy the transmitters without knowing their exact locations. But there was one thing Britain could attempt immediately: interfere with the beams themselves. Not brute force jamming. That would reveal that Britain understood the system. The Luftwaffe would adapt. They would shift frequencies, alter modulation patterns, or deploy backup systems. The engineer knew the danger of direct interference. He needed something quieter, something subtle, a way to sabotage the beams without Germany realizing it. He turned to a set of British transmitters located along the southern coast. These stations were modest compared to the German arrays, built for regional broadcasting and communications. They lacked the power to drown out the Luftwaffe's long-range beams. But they could create small distortions, phase shifts, frequency nudges, tiny warps that would appear to German pilots as natural atmospheric fluctuations, a deception rather than an attack. The engineer began calculating how to overlay British signals atop the German beams without revealing the operation. He needed a frequency close enough to interact with the beam, but not so close as to be detected by German technicians monitoring their own networks. The solution lay in phase interference, a slight delay timed to create ambiguity in the pilot's perception of where the beam's center truly was. If done correctly, the pilot would believe he was flying along the correct corridor, even as the course drifted by half a mile. In poor visibility, that drift would push bombs off the intended target and into open fields. It would not stop the raids, but it could blunt their effectiveness. He drafted the proposal and brought it to the senior scientific advisor, who recognized at once the practical genius in its restraint. They needed only to mislead, not overpower. The British transmitters were retuned rapidly. Technicians rewired sections of the equipment to allow tighter control over frequency adjustments. Antenna angles were recalibrated to maximize interaction with the incoming beams. The work was tense. Every adjustment needed to be precise, too strong, and Germany would know the beams were compromised. Too weak, and the Luftwaffe would continue striking with near-perfect accuracy. By the time the inland bomber group crossed the sea, the countermeasure stations were ready. Operators monitored the German beams carefully. When the first aircraft approached the long-range guide, the British transmitters activated, sending carefully timed distortions into the air. The interference was nearly invisible, just a faint phase ripple sliding along the German carrier. To an engineer, it was detectable. To a pilot in a noisy cockpit, it was indistinguishable from weather. Within minutes, reports from the coastal stations confirmed the interference was working. The beam's center shifted subtly left, then stabilized. To a pilot relying on audio cues, the illusion was perfect. A steady tone meant they were aligned. In reality, they were drifting. The engineer tracked the formation's path across the map. It no longer followed the clean geometric line he had drawn earlier. It angled off by a small but meaningful distance. If the deviation held, the bombers would overshoot the machine tool district and hit farmland instead. He allowed himself a single breath of relief, though he knew the battle had only begun. Across the room, the radar operator called out new altitudes. The bombers were descending, preparing to release their loads. The interference needed to maintain its subtlety through this final phase. If the Luftwaffe sensed anything unusual, they would adjust manually, or worse, begin doubting their beams altogether. The engineer checked the modulation again. The timing pulses remained consistent. The secondary cues were unchanged. The deception had not been detected. But as the bomber group neared the inland district, something unexpected happened. A new signal emerged, one that matched neither the long-range guides nor the correction beams. It was faint at first, then grew in clarity. Another German transmitter had activated. The new beam intersected the inland targeting line at almost exactly the point where the British interference was creating the drift. It carried a different pattern, a rapid oscillation designed to confirm final alignment. The Luftwaffe had built redundancy into their system. If the primary beam drifted, the secondary would correct it. The engineer calculated the odds of the interference working against a dual beam configuration. The result sent a chill through him. The redundancy reduced the drift effect dramatically. Even a few seconds of exposure to the new alignment beams could correct the pilot's course. He moved quickly to the console and adjusted the British transmitter phase angle. The technicians responded instantly, tuning their equipment to offset the secondary beam. But the window was narrowing. The bombers were too close to the inland district. The engineer watched the radar tracks. If the course adjustment took hold, the bombs would fall squarely on the machine tool factories. If not, the deception would hold, and Britain would survive the raid with minimal losses. The Coastal Intercept Station relayed an update moments later. The pilot chatter, faint but interpretable, suggested confusion. They were hearing two tones instead of one. The beams were colliding in the cockpit. The pilots were trying to correct but could not determine which signal was authoritative. The drift returned. The formation overshot the invisible crossing point by several hundred yards. The bombers released. The radar operators listened for the telltale echoes of impact. When they came, the reports from ground observers confirmed it. The bombs had missed the factories. Most detonated across empty fields and hedgerows. The first British countermeasure had worked. But the engineer did not celebrate. Even as the room around him exhaled relief, he saw the last intercept in his hand. The faint but unmistakable signature of the German redundancy beam. Germany had not just built a network. They had built a system designed to overcome interference. And if they adapted quickly enough, Britain's advantage would evaporate. The engineer looked back at the map. Tonight, the country had survived. But Germany had revealed something new, a level of technical sophistication Britain had not yet matched. The inland strike had been blunted, but the engineer knew the victory was temporary. Germany's dual-beam redundancy signaled a level of sophistication Britain had underestimated. If the Luftwaffe realized the drift was artificial, they would recalibrate, adjust their modulation patterns, and restore their accuracy. Britain needed something stronger than improvised distortions. It needed a plan, systematic, scalable, and by source. He returned to the analysis room long after most personnel had cleared out. Only a few night operators remained, their receivers glowing softly in the dim light. The engineer spread the intercepted signals across the table, arranging them with the precision of someone studying not just equipment, but intent. Germany's beam structure was more than a set of transmitters. It was doctrine, long-range guidance, correction corridors, timing pulses, redundancy beams, fallback lines. An entire architecture built to make pilots nearly immune to darkness and weather. From an engineering standpoint, it was brilliant. From a military standpoint, it was devastating. He moved to a chalkboard and began sketching out what Britain needed to counter it. Not a single trick. Not a single night solution. A structured response. One that paralleled Germany's system in discipline and scale. First, Britain needed a map of every German beam, not approximations. Precise alignments, bearings, and modulation signatures. The engineer marked the beams already discovered, then added the inland vector and its crossbeam. He knew more existed. German engineering doctrine never operated in isolated pockets. If they had built a network, it would be complete across the western coastline. Second, Britain needed to understand how German crews interpreted the beams. The engineer dug into technical notes from pre-war civil aviation research. German blind landing equipment used specific cockpit indicators, tones separated by narrow modulation gaps, audio cues fed through headphones, and occasionally a flutter needle that twitched when the aircraft drifted off-center. If the Luftwaffe reused these systems, the countermeasures would need to exploit the same cues. A faint tone at the edge of hearing. A modulation shift too subtle for technicians to isolate. A delayed pulse that created ambiguity in the pilot's perception. Not brute force. Manipulated perception. He scribbled notes rapidly, outlining how British transmitters could create targeted illusions. Instead of shifting the entire beam, Britain could create ghost corridors, false guidance lines that paralleled the real ones. Pilots would believe they were on the correct path while drifting miles off course. The deception could be tuned to activate only when bombers approached critical regions. Outside those regions, the signal would fade seamlessly, leaving the Luftwaffe convinced their equipment was working normally. The engineer paused, feeling the weight of time pressing in. If Britain did not expand countermeasures quickly, the next raids would be far deadlier. Germany had already demonstrated the ability to retune transmitters in real time. If they introduced new redundancy beams or changed modulations, the British response had to be ready within hours, not days. He drafted a proposal for a dedicated counterbeam network, stations positioned along the coast, each capable of low-power, frequency-agile transmission. The stations would operate under strict secrecy. Their role would not be to overwhelm or jam, but to mislead with precision. A silent battle fought in fractions of a kilohertz. As he assembled the proposal, a junior operator approached with a clipboard of new intercepts. The engineer scanned them quickly. Most were routine. Communication bursts, atmospheric noise, fragments of distant transmissions. But one stood out. A beam identical in structure to the inland vector had been detected hundreds of miles from the previous location. The bearings converged, far to the north, on a region Britain had not considered a likely target. It was an industrial zone producing alloy components for high-performance engines. Small in geographic footprint, but vital to aircraft production. He plotted the new beam on the map. It was angled sharply, not from Germany's central coast, but from a more northern transmitter site, one Britain had tracked only sporadically. Analysts had assumed the site supported naval communications. They had been wrong. The new beam's modulation carried a signature the engineer recognized immediately, a twin-tone envelope used for terminal alignment. It was the kind of signal a pilot would rely on when approaching a target obscured by night or cloud cover. Germany had activated a fresh targeting corridor. He added the beam to the chalkboard. The pattern was growing more complex, forming a lattice stretching across Britain like a grid of invisible rails. Each beam offered the Luftwaffe another way to reach a strategic site. He returned to his proposal and added a final requirement. Britain needed a centralized command to track, analyze, and counter every beam the moment it emerged. No more scattered analysis, no more improvised responses. A unified counterbeam center. Before he could finalize the wording, an operator called out from the far end of the room. A new intercept was coming through, clear, strong, and distinct. The tone carried a slow oscillation, unlike the steady signals used for guidance. The engineer leaned in, listening. It wasn't a navigation beam. It was a calibration signal, the kind used only when a transmitter was being tuned for operational readiness. That meant the Luftwaffe was preparing another corridor, not tomorrow. Tonight. He checked the bearing. The calibration pointed toward yet another region, one with fuel depots and storage tanks critical to Britain's aviation supply chain. The Luftwaffe had not launched the raid yet, but the beam was warming, aligning, testing. A new attack corridor was being built in real time. The engineer stepped back from the table. Britain was no longer responding to a single threat. It was confronting a living system, one that could shift, expand, and adapt at a moment's notice. And somewhere in the darkness across the sea, a new transmitter had just come online. The calibration tone from the new transmitter rose and fell with mechanical precision, a slow oscillation that signaled meticulous tuning. It meant German technicians were aligning a fresh corridor across the North Sea, not a test, not a rehearsal, a build-up to an operational beam. The engineer listened to the signal on a headset, noting the purity of the carrier. No jitter, no instability. Whoever was controlling the transmitter knew exactly what they were doing. He recorded the frequency and mapped the inbound bearing. The line crossed the coastline near a cluster of fuel depots that fed the RAF's primary training command. If the Luftwaffe struck those depots, the country wouldn't lose aircraft directly, but it would lose the ability to train crews at scale. The impact would be silent, but devastating. Fewer pilots in the air months down the line. He compared the new signal with previous calibrations. The signature was slightly different. Narrower bandwidth, cleaner side lobes. It suggested an upgraded transmitter or a newer model, something Germany had introduced recently. That discovery troubled him. Every time Britain adapted, Germany seemed to push forward with a refined iteration of their system. The engineer asked the night operators to sweep adjacent frequencies. If a calibration beam was active, other components of the corridor would soon come online. He expected a correction signal or a timing pulse. Instead, the receivers picked up something else. Faint fragments of speech. Not commands, not navigation instructions. German technicians were talking. The room froze as the operators increased gain and isolated the audio. Under normal conditions, beam frequencies carried only tones. For technicians to speak over them meant they were conducting live alignment work. The engineer listened to the clipped phrases, short exchanges in technical German. Parts of the conversation were distorted by atmospheric echo, but one detail stood out with absolute clarity. They referenced Eastern Mast Sequence. It confirmed what he suspected. Germany wasn't adjusting a single transmitter. They were tuning an entire chain. He immediately requested bearing triangulation. Within minutes, operators from multiple listening posts relayed their measurements. The bearings intersected in 3 distinct coastal regions, forming a triangle of transmission sources. Each transmitter was being realigned toward Britain with coordinated timing. He checked the angles. They converged not only on the fuel depots, but also on a nearby rail junction, one that fed military material into the Midlands. It was a dual-target configuration, a primary industrial target paired with a strategic infrastructure point. Germany was preparing a layered attack. The engineer leaned over the plotting table, retracing the geometry. Something felt off. The bearings were too precise for a simple fuel raid. The Luftwaffe rarely committed multiple beams to a single logistical site. It suggested another scenario, either a larger strike package or the testing of a new beam configuration designed to improve accuracy at long range. He asked the optical intercept team to check for any harmonic distortions. Within seconds, they found what he feared, a faint tertiary peak, barely above atmospheric noise. It indicated a secondary beam nested inside the primary. This technique, beam multiplexing, allowed the Germans to send subtle modulation cues without transmitting an entirely separate frequency. Britain had not seen this capability before. Germany had upgraded their system. The engineer made rapid calculations. If multiplexing allowed the Luftwaffe to combine correction data and timing pulses into a single beam, then Britain's countermeasure, phase interference, would become far harder to apply. A single distorted signal could be compensated for by the secondary cues embedded inside it. The redundancy would be invisible to an untrained observer. The room around him grew tense. The night operators watched as he marked new intercept arcs on the board. If Germany had integrated multiple beam functions into one channel, they could increase accuracy while reducing the British ability to disrupt them. He turned toward the technicians manning the British counterbeam transmitters. Their equipment was already warm, awaiting orders. But the engineer knew the old method wouldn't hold, not against a multiplexed corridor. The counterbeam needed to target the redundancy itself, not the main tone. He sketched out a new approach on a notepad. Instead of shifting the center line, the British transmitters would aim to disrupt the embedded modulation, the subtle variations inside the beam that German pilots relied on during final approach. A deceptive echo, a false shadow. He described the method quickly. The technicians understood the risk. If the echo was too strong, Germany would detect it instantly. If too weak, it would be ignored. The interference had to be shaped with surgical control. As the new plan took form, a radar operator called out a new bearing. Aircraft were rising from airfields along Germany's northern coastline. Not many. Not yet. But the pattern matched early phases of previous beam-guided raids. The Luftwaffe was mobilizing. The engineer checked the clock. The calibration beam had been active long enough for the corridor to be operational. Within an hour, German bombers could be riding the invisible guide toward the fuel depots. He gave the order. The British counterbeam stations activated. A low hum filled the room as transmitters along the southern and eastern coastlines shifted to the new modulation disruption method. Small bursts of precisely delayed signal slipped into the air, barely detectable, designed to nudge the redundancy tones rather than the primary carrier. Moments later, the effect registered. The German beam flickered by a fraction. The correction tone stabilized, then wavered again. It was subtle, so subtle a German technician might attribute it to weather. But in the cockpit of an incoming bomber, the cues would begin to conflict. The operators were still monitoring the interaction when a new intercept arrived, one that caused the engineer to stop mid-sentence. The Germans had activated a second multiplexed beam, one that did not align with the fuel depots, one that pointed directly at an urban center miles away. Germany wasn't preparing one corridor. They were preparing two, simultaneously. A dual operation night, a tactic Britain had not yet seen. The Luftwaffe was about to test whether its upgraded beam network could control two strike groups at once. And both beams were now active. The twin beams, two fully operational attack corridors, were now cutting across the North Sea like invisible rails. One pointed at the fuel depots, the other threaded toward a dense urban district whose factories supplied parts for Britain's aircraft repair program. If both strikes landed cleanly, the consequences would echo for months. Training capacity crippled, repair throughput throttled. Britain's frontline strength weakened without a single dogfight. The engineer stood over the plotting table as the dual beams took shape across the board. Their geometry was deliberate, angled to avoid overlap, spaced far enough apart to prevent mutual interference. Germany was testing the limits of its network. If the double corridor operation worked, there would be nothing stopping them from opening 3, 4, or even 5 beams simultaneously in future raids. It would overwhelm Britain's defenses. He tightened the headset against his ear and listened again to the multiplexed tones hidden beneath the carrier wave. The redundancy in each beam was stronger than the previous night, cleaner, better modulated. If one guidance cue faltered, another took its place instantly. The Luftwaffe had designed their system to behave like a living structure, elastic, adaptive, self-correcting. He turned to the technicians controlling the counterbeam stations. Their new modulation disruption method had succeeded against a single corridor. But two simultaneous corridors, each using multiplexed cues, created a new problem. Any distortion introduced to weaken one beam risked unintentionally affecting the other. Interference could bleed across frequency edges. If that happened, Germany would know. He examined the frequencies again. The beams were close in spectrum, but not overlapping. A narrow gap separated them, too thin for wideband interference, but wide enough for an engineered, frequency-specific maneuver. They would have to shape the disruption like a scalpel, not a drift, not a phase wobble, a microscopic fracture inside the redundancy cues. He pulled a slide rule from his pocket and ran the numbers. If the British transmitters inserted a timed ripple that echoed only within a narrow band of the redundancy tones, the German primary signal would remain unchanged. The pilot would hear a stable centerline tone, but the subtle alignment cues layered on top would become contradictory. It wouldn't throw the bomber off course by miles, but it could cause enough confusion to force crews to release late or release blind. He outlined the maneuver on a sheet of drafting paper, marking the delay intervals in fractions of milliseconds. The technicians nodded, understanding the delicacy required. Their equipment could perform the task, but only if tuned perfectly. As they prepared the transmitters, a radar operator called out a new movement. 2 bomber groups had taken to the air. One rose from airfields near Bremen, the other from bases further south. Their tracks were tight, disciplined, and headed straight for the respective beams. The Luftwaffe was fully committed. The engineer checked the intercept logs. The calibration tones from earlier had ceased. The beams were now stable. Germany had locked them for operational use. He stepped closer to the receivers monitoring the dual corridors. At first, both beams held perfectly steady. Then, as the British counterbeam stations introduced the new ripple, he saw it, a faint distortion inside the embedded redundancy cues. A small victory, but it needed to hold. As the bombers neared the halfway point over the North Sea, the effect began to surface. Operators monitoring German chatter attempted to isolate cockpit signals. Faint voices crackled across the receivers. It was impossible to translate full sentences, but tone and tension were unmistakable. Pilots were hearing something unexpected. 2 cues where one should have been. The engineer traced the bomber formations. The fuel depot group drifted slightly offline, then overcorrected. The urban target group held steady longer, but subtle deviations soon appeared in their altitude reports. Nothing dramatic, but enough to show the deception was working. At this stage, any deviation mattered. He returned to the board and noticed something else, something he'd missed earlier. The 2 corridors were synchronized. Their timing pulses matched almost perfectly. That meant the Germans were running both attacks on a shared clock. It also meant that if Britain disrupted the timing cues on one corridor, the second might inherit the distortion inadvertently. He considered the risk. If both beams collapsed too obviously, Germany would know. The deception depended on subtlety. Britain needed to mislead, not reveal its hand. He made a decision. Only the redundancy cues would be targeted. The primary timing pulses had to remain untouched. As the British counter-beam technicians adjusted their equipment, a fresh intercept arrived, this time from a northern monitoring post. It carried a startling discovery. A 3rd German beam had activated briefly, then shut down. A test pulse. It had not been used to guide aircraft, but it confirmed the engineer's fear. Germany was preparing multiple alternates. The Luftwaffe had built a layered web, not 2 simple corridors. He updated the board and returned to the radar screen. The bomber formations were approaching British airspace. If the deception worked, the crews would release bombs off target, missing key sites by enough distance to spare the infrastructure. But if the redundancy tones overpowered the distortions, the bombs would land exactly where intended. The engineer leaned over the radar table as the first group neared the coastline. The operators watched the glowing markers with silent intensity. Altitude steady, speed steady, formation tight. The pilots clearly trusted their beams. Seconds passed. The markers crossed into British airspace. Then, finally, a deviation. The fuel depot group drifted north by a visible margin. It was slight, but meaningful. The engineer checked the map. If the drift held, the bombs would fall short of the depots and detonate harmlessly across empty storage fields. But the second group, the urban target bombers, held formation. They were still on track. The distortion had not been strong enough on their corridor. He calculated frantically. The redundancy cues embedded in the urban beam were stronger, more heavily modulated. The Germans had reinforced this corridor, anticipating resistance or atmospheric instability. It was the more important target. The engineer turned to the technicians. They would have to increase the modulation disruption. Not globally, not across the beam, only inside one specific segment of the redundancy envelope. It was dangerous, If too strong, Germany would notice the interference within days. If too weak, the bombs would hit their mark. He gave the order. The technicians retuned their equipment, creating a deeper echo inside the embedded cues, just enough to disorient, not enough to reveal intent. They activated the disruption. The radar markers shuddered, then drifted, just enough. The engineer exhaled slowly, but before relief could settle, a new signal emerged from the receivers. A fresh German tone, stronger than the others, cut across the spectrum. A stabilizer beam. Germany had deployed a countermeasure. The stabilizer beam hit the receivers with a clarity that cut through every other tone on the spectrum. It arrived without warning. No calibration, warm-up, no incremental tuning, just a sudden, surgically precise carrier wave that locked into place, as if it had been waiting silently for its moment to activate. The engineer froze. This wasn't redundancy. This wasn't correction. This was override. A stabilizer beam served one purpose: to drown out any small deviations within the pilot's guidance cues. It flattened inconsistencies. It smoothed turbulence in the audio signals. It acted like an anchor against interference. In civilian aviation, the technique was used sparingly, usually during final approach in thick fog. But the Luftwaffe had adapted it for wartime use. The engineer had hoped Germany wouldn't attempt such a maneuver. Stabilizers were risky. They boosted clarity but reduced pilot autonomy. If conditions changed suddenly, pilots relying on a stabilizer could misjudge altitude or drift unknowingly. It was the kind of tool only a force confident in its system would activate mid-mission. And Germany had just done exactly that. The beam pulsed with a consistent amplitude envelope, steady even, unbroken. The embedded modulation was brutally simple, deliberately stripped of nuance. Instead of layered cues, it offered one command: maintain course. Everything else became background noise. That included Britain's carefully constructed distortions. Within minutes, the effects became visible on the radar plots. The fuel depot group, the one that had been drifting north, began correcting itself. Not wildly, but progressively. The stabilizer was overriding the deception the engineer had crafted. The crews were hearing the strongest tone in the cockpit and instinctively aligning to it. He compared the tracks. The bombers were still offline, but the margin was shrinking. If nothing changed, they would regain enough accuracy to hit the edges of the fuel depots, not a complete success, but far more damaging than the near-miss Britain had been aiming for. The urban target group behaved differently. Their redundancy cues had been disrupted earlier, and the stabilizer beam forced them to choose between two signals. For several minutes, their formation wavered. But as the stabilizer grew stronger, they gradually returned to their original heading. The engineer saw the pattern and recognized the brutal elegance of the German design. The stabilizer beam wasn't meant to override Britain entirely. It was meant to clean up the auxiliary beams, to suppress the echoes and distortions that countermeasures it exploited. Germany had anticipated interference, and they had built a shield for it. He felt a cold weight settle in his chest. The countermeasure duel had entered a new phase. He turned to the technicians. They were already adjusting settings, increasing gain, retuning delay intervals, attempting to carve new cracks into the redundancy cues. But the stabilizer beam flattened everything. Their distortions still existed in the air, but to the pilots, the stabilizer's unwavering tone masked them perfectly. The engineer returned to the chalkboard and traced the stabilizer beam's frequency. It was higher than the previous beams, sitting at the edge of the spectrum Germany typically avoided. It meant the transmitter was likely new, perhaps experimental. He checked the modulation. The stabilizer used a low-bandwidth signature, unusual for wartime equipment. The Luftwaffe was deploying advanced hardware, possibly introduced only weeks earlier. Britain had no intelligence on it. He scribbled calculations, searching for a weakness. Every system had one. Stabilizer beams offered clarity but created a problem of their own. They made the navigation experience too clean. Real atmospheric conditions always produced minor fluctuations, and pilots instinctively learned to expect them. A perfectly smooth tone could create uncertainty, doubt. He needed to exploit that. He proposed a new countermeasure: micro-interference. Not enough to shift the beam, not enough to distort cues, but enough to reintroduce natural noise into the stabilizer. If pilots heard a tone that was too perfect, they trusted the system. But if they heard minor imperfections, they instinctively cross-checked other cues. This created a window, just seconds, for the British distortions targeting the redundancy to take hold again. It was a gamble, but the only one available. He outlined the plan to the technicians. They recalibrated their equipment with steady hands, but tense expressions. The micro-interference needed to be so subtle that it blended seamlessly with atmospheric drift. They tuned the amplitude to microscopic deviations, adjusting phasing in fractions of degrees. When ready, the engineer gave a single nod. The micro-interference activated. The stabilizer beam twitched, almost imperceptibly. But enough. The radar plots registered a moment of hesitation in the bomber formations. Not a turn. Not a drift. A pause, like crews making a rapid cross-check. The redundancy signals beneath the stabilizer, weakened by earlier British distortions, flickered in and out of clarity. Pilot confidence wavered for seconds. Seconds were enough. The fuel depot group stabilized short of its original correction. They were too close to regain perfect alignment before release. Their bombs would still miss the central tanks. The urban target group shifted a degree to the right, small on a map but significant over miles. The engineer traced the new line. If the shift held, the bombs would land outside the dense factory zone. The stabilizer beam surged again, Germany compensating. It forced the lines back toward center, but the timing was too late. The bombers were already beginning their descent. He listened to the intercept chatter, engines roaring, crews preparing release, tone signals blending with cockpit noise. Then came the echoes. Dull thuds, spreading across countryside and industrial outskirts. The strike had landed, off target. Not by luck. By inches. By seconds. By a countermeasure designed in a dimly lit room and executed against overwhelming odds. But the engineer didn't celebrate. Germany had revealed an entirely new capability. A stabilizer beam powerful enough to shield entire formations. A transmitter Britain had never seen. A technology that could become decisive if multiplied along the coast. He returned to the map. If the Luftwaffe possessed more stabilizers, Britain's defenses would be strained beyond their limits. And as he reviewed the latest intercept logs, a chilling detail emerged. The stabilizer's frequency carried a harmonic signature. One that indicated not a single transmitter, but a network of them. The stabilizer beam's harmonic signature remained on the engineer's desk long after the night's raid ended. He studied it with the kind of focus reserved for rare discoveries. Unusual, unsettling, impossible to ignore. Harmonics could reveal secrets that carriers concealed. They were like fingerprints left behind by machinery, each curve and ripple shaped by the construction of the transmitter itself. And this stabilizer had not one fingerprint. It had several. He leaned closer to the oscilloscope trace, noting how the harmonics repeated across different intercepts. Not identical. No two transmitters were ever perfectly matched, but grouped, clustered. Each harmonic peak sat close to a companion peak, spaced in the same ratio. It was a pattern no single transmitter could produce. He pulled earlier intercept sheets from the stack, long-range beams, correction beams, timing pulses, multiplexed corridors. He aligned them beside the stabilizer trace. One by one, they revealed subtle harmonic relationships, minute similarities hidden in the noise. The engineer felt a tightening in his chest. These beams weren't independent. They were built using the same architecture, the same engineering philosophy, the same core design. It meant something profound, as obvious as it was alarming. Germany's beam network wasn't improvised. It wasn't cobbled together in response to British defenses. It was the product of a single blueprint, a blueprint Britain had never seen. He exhaled slowly. If the Luftwaffe operated a unified system, then every transmitter along their coast was part of a coordinated whole. The beams guiding bombers across hundreds of miles were not standalone innovations. They were modules of a larger, integrated navigation grid. A grid capable of expansion, improvement, adaptation. He pulled a map across the table and marked every confirmed transmitter location. Then he added the probable sites, places where bearings intersected with suspicious structures or existing radio facilities. As the dots multiplied, a shape emerged along the German shoreline, a chain of stations spaced at deliberate intervals, each placed to ensure overlapping coverage, each spaced to maintain coherent beam geometry. No gaps, no redundancies, no randomness. He felt a chill. This was a national infrastructure project, not a military improvisation. Months of planning, massive investment. Teams of engineers working in secret long before the first German bomber crossed the channel. Britain had never seen the system as a whole, only its tips, only the beams that happened to shine across the sea. Now, for the first time, the engineer was looking at the skeleton beneath it. He reached for reconnaissance files from the year before the war. Germany had spent considerable resources expanding civilian radio infrastructure, ostensibly to increase broadcast range. But many of those civilian masts sat precisely where his map now placed German military beam transmitters. A cover story. A clever one. And Britain had accepted it at face value. Before he could process the implications, a technician brought the latest intercept logs from northern listening posts. The engineer scanned the pages. Among the routine fragments, one line caught his eye. A second stabilizer beam had been detected, but only for a few minutes, and much further north than the previous one. He checked the harmonic signature. It matched the same pattern. Another stabilizer, another station, another piece of the architecture. He marked it on the board. Then he noticed something else, something easy to miss. The stabilizers weren't placed randomly. They followed a spacing rule, roughly the same distance between each point. A grid within the grid. He pulled out a ruler and aligned the distances. The spacing wasn't perfect, but close enough to prove intentional design. Germany had created a network of stabilizers to support the beam corridors during long-range operations. A backbone system, one Britain had mistaken for isolated equipment. He felt the urgency rising. Britain's countermeasures had succeeded against one stabilizer, but a network was a different threat entirely. If multiple stabilizers coordinated their signals, the Luftwaffe could launch attacks across different regions simultaneously, each guided by a perfectly reinforced corridor. It would make disruption exponentially harder. He approached the technicians who had executed the micro-interference during the raid. "We're not dealing with a single transmitter," he said quietly. "We're dealing with a system designed to maintain coherence, no matter how we interfere." The technicians exchanged uneasy glances. They understood what that meant. Their delicate manipulations had worked once. But against a coordinated stabilizer network, the airwaves themselves could fight back. He pressed the point. "We need to find where the stabilizers overlap. That's the only place their signals become vulnerable." A young operator spoke up. "If they overlap at all." The engineer didn't respond. He didn't need to. The map already told the story. There was only one region, one narrow arc over the North Sea, where the stabilizer harmonics converged, a weakness hidden in plain sight, created by the geometry of Germany's own system. He circled the convergence point on the map. If Britain could exploit that seam, it might shatter the stabilizer network's ability to mask distortions. If not, the Luftwaffe would soon guide bombers with a precision Britain could no longer disrupt. But as he prepared the next phase of analysis, a message arrived from a coastal observation post. A brief, faint signal, barely above the noise floor. But unmistakable. A new German frequency, unlike any previously recorded. Stable, narrow, cold. The engineer recognized the shape immediately. It wasn't a beam, it was the first sign of an entirely different device. And whatever it was, it came from deep inside Germany, not the coast. The new frequency arrived as a whisper, so faint it nearly vanished into atmospheric static. But its shape was unmistakable. The engineer leaned over the trace with a sharpened intensity. Nothing about it resembled the coastal beams. No correction tones, no timing pulses, no multiplexed structure. It was a single, razor-thin carrier, steady as a metronome. A long-range transmitter, but not a navigational one. He checked the bearing from the coastal post. The line pointed far beyond the German shoreline, deep into the interior, well past the industrial belt. No known beam station existed there. No coastal infrastructure. No logical reason for a signal to originate from that distance, unless Germany had built something new, something larger, something capable of projecting power across half a continent. He circled the location on the map. The point landed near a region known for heavy manufacturing, an area associated with early radio research long before the war. It offered the electrical capacity and space for an installation far more ambitious than a standard beam transmitter. He reviewed the intercept again. The carrier showed no drift, no flutter, no atmospheric wobble. It meant the transmitter was immense. High-power circuitry, tight frequency control, likely stabilized by a quartz system, something not used casually in wartime equipment. He tapped the paper once, thinking. A strategic transmitter. Not tactical. Not coastal. Centralized. The night operators watched as he pulled earlier records, scraps of chatter, fragments of intercepted technical communication, weather reports from German stations. He found nothing that directly explained the signal, but scattered references to extended range trials and deep channel testing hinted at a broader plan. He checked the harmonics from the new signal. They were sparse, clean, spaced with mathematical regularity. These were not the fingerprints of a coastal station rushing to recalibrate for a raid. They were the harmonics of a meticulously engineered device, one with a purpose that extended beyond immediate battlefield needs. He began comparing the new signal with those from the stabilizer network. It didn't match them, not even close. But the difference wasn't random, it was systemic. The stabilizers were built to reinforce beams. This transmitter was not. This transmitter wasn't supporting beams. It was designed to control them. A central command node for Germany's entire network. The engineer stood still for a moment, letting the implications settle. If Germany had built a central transmitter capable of coordinating distant beam stations, then every corridor Britain had countered could eventually be adjusted in real time, synchronized from deep inside enemy territory. Countermeasures would become harder. Beam disruptions would be corrected faster. Stabilizers could be coordinated in clusters. The Luftwaffe would gain the ability to shift attack paths mid-flight with unprecedented precision. He reviewed the intercept logs again. The signal had been active for only a few minutes before disappearing. A test activation, a systems check, not a full broadcast. Germany was tuning it, preparing for operational use. He ran calculations on the potential coverage area. The results were sobering. A device of that power, if fully engaged, could reach across the North Sea, past Britain's coastline, and deep into the Midlands. It would give Germany the ability to initiate beams from farther inland, bypassing the limitations of coastal geography. It meant the map of potential corridor origins had just expanded dramatically. Britain's listening posts were no longer positioned correctly. The defense assumptions were outdated before dawn. He pushed back from the table and moved to another workstation. The technicians followed, waiting. They had seen the pattern developing over nights of tension. Germany unveiled new capabilities in increments, each one introduced only after Britain countered the previous. This was not coincidence. It was adaptation. If the central transmitter went operational, the Luftwaffe's beam network would evolve faster than Britain's countermeasures could adjust. He placed a transparent grid overlay onto the map, a tool for plotting propagation ranges. When he aligned it with the transmitter's suspected location, a new corridor opened across the sea, covering regions untouched by beams so far. This discovery forced a new understanding. Germany was preparing to expand its target list. He traced the projected path again. The beam would intersect the eastern coastline near a cluster of munitions storage sites, facilities critical for supplying anti-aircraft batteries. He examined the angle more closely. It wasn't exact. The beam hadn't been fully tuned. But the alignment was too close to dismiss. Even a test pulse had meaning. The engineer documented everything, drafting a report with urgency. The stabilizer network was no longer the peak of German capability. The coastal beam grid was not the full system. The multiplexed corridors were not the final evolution. The long-range frequency hinted at something larger. A backbone that could connect all German stations, unify their operation, and increase precision across the board. As he prepared to deliver the report to senior command, a message came from the Northern Observation Post. A second long-range pulse had been detected, not identical, but clearly from the same device. This one was weaker, drifting slightly, as if the transmitter were being retuned or rotated. The engineer checked the bearing. It landed on a completely different region of Britain, a factory district producing high-grade alloy sheet metal, a strategic lifeline for aircraft manufacturing. One transmitter. Two different alignments, minutes apart. Germany wasn't just testing power, they were testing reach, flexibility, target selection. The engineer's pen hovered over the map. This wasn't the evolution of beams. This was the emergence of a command instrument, a master frequency capable of shaping future raids. His next report would be the most urgent of the war so far, because Britain was no longer facing a battlefield system. It was facing a national network guided by a single, unseen pulse, one that had just awakened deep inside the Reich. The long-range pulses from deep inside Germany replayed on the engineer's receiver long after the room had emptied. He listened to the cold, unwavering tone with the awareness that this was no longer an intercept. It was a declaration. Germany had moved beyond coastal transmitters, beyond corridors cut across water, beyond stabilizers built to harden beams against interference. They were preparing to operate from the interior of the Reich itself, projecting control across nations, not miles. He stood alone at the plotting table, the dim lights reflecting off the map's surface. Every corridor, every correction line, every stabilizer, every harmonic fingerprint, laid out like a skeleton of the enemy's thinking. He could now see the outline of the entire system. Germany had built a navigational machine, a machine that could guide bombers with mathematical certainty. A machine designed to adapt, recalibrate, and strike with evolving precision. And now, the machine had acquired a central pulse. He gathered all 15 chapters of the war he had lived through. Days of analysis, nights of silent intercepts, Hours spent studying signals while the country slept. The story was not one of symbols and equations, but of the people who had trusted his work to keep cities standing. Tonight, that trust faced its final test. He moved to the window. Outside, the blackout cloaked the city. No lights, no silhouettes. Britain had learned to live inside darkness. It was the only shield they had left. He returned to the map and placed his hand over the circle marking the new transmitter deep inside Germany. A system like this could not be matched, beam for beam. It could not be suppressed through improvisation. It had to be defeated by understanding the very principle that made it strong. A network was powerful because it was connected, and anything that connected could be made to misalign. He sat at the desk and began designing Britain's final countermeasure. Not a distortion, not a drift, but an exploitation of the stabilizer network itself. The long-range transmitter depended on coordination. If Britain injected microscopic delays, timed irregularities that mimicked natural atmospheric reflection, the stabilizers would begin compensating prematurely. Every correction the stabilizers made would create another imbalance they would try to fix. The system would fight itself. A self-correcting network pushed beyond its limits became unstable. He calculated the parameters, frequencies, phase intervals, delay on set times. It would not collapse the beams. It would not break the system. It would simply confuse it at its own frequency, forcing it to create errors instead of solving them. The beauty was in the subtlety. Germany would see clean carriers on their end, but their bombers would hear guidance that shifted by inches, and inches mattered at 200 miles per hour. He finished the blueprint and handed it to the technicians with steady hands. "This is the last step," he said quietly. "If we can't turn their system against itself, no countermeasure after this will matter." They understood. By dawn, Britain's first long-range modulation disruptor was in place, retuned, calibrated, ready. Less than 24 hours later, German airfields stirred again. Radar reports arrived. 2 large bomber groups rising, flying toward the North Sea. Another test of the new corridors. Another attempt to prove the central transmitter's power. The engineer stood in the command room as the German beams aligned. The long-range pulse activated, crisp and commanding. The stabilizer network followed. Everything Germany had built was now humming in unison. Britain activated the disruptor. At first, nothing happened. The German beams remained steady. The stabilizers held. Then, slowly, the harmonics of the stabilizer network began to shift. Tiny tremors inside the waveform, imperceptible to Germany's technicians, but unmistakable to the trained ear. The stabilizers compensated. Then overcompensated. They corrected again. Then again. Each correction created another fault, a cascade. The radar operators leaned closer. The first bomber formation drifted, then corrected. Then drifted again, this time inconsistently, unable to anchor to a stable guide. The cockpit signals must have sounded wrong. Tones too clean one second, too erratic the next. Pilots relying on the stabilizers would be receiving contradictory cues. The Luftwaffe responded, as expected, by activating the secondary correction beams. But those beams depended on the stabilizer's coherence. The more corrections introduced, the more the embedded cues fractured. In minutes, the dual corridor precision collapsed into noise. Not enough to cause chaos, enough to drain clarity, enough to force every crew to fly blind for the final miles. The engineer watched silently as the markers on the plotting table dispersed, not wildly, not dramatically, but just enough to break the intended geometry. Bomb release echoes arrived one by one, far outside the strategic zones Germany had aimed for. Storage fields, open moorlands, empty industrial yards, buildings shaken but intact. The long-range pulse had failed its first operational test, not because Britain overwhelmed it, but because the system's strength had become its weakness. The network that required perfect harmony had met a disruption that created tiny, constant disharmonies, just enough to unravel its precision. The room remained quiet for a long time. Britain had not won the war, but it had survived the night. The engineer closed his notebook, not with triumph, but with the heavy understanding that technology evolves, counter-technology follows, and the cycle continues. The Luftwaffe still possessed power. Their beams still existed. Their central transmitter would appear again. But Britain was no longer reacting blindly. It understood the architecture now. It had mapped the unseen. It had learned to fight a war waged in invisible lines across the sky. The engineer stepped outside into the quiet morning. The blackout still lifted only in fragments. Planes roared overhead, RAF aircraft returning to their fields, navigating by their own systems, flawed but independent. He looked toward the horizon. No beams, no pulses, no signals, just a nation beginning another day. Britain had faced an enemy armed with precision and answered with understanding. The silent war in the airwaves would continue. But for the first time, Britain wasn't just defending itself, it was shaping the battlefield. And the invisible lines Germany had drawn across the night sky, the lines meant to guide its bombers unopposed, had become the very lines that exposed its hidden war plan. The engineer walked back toward the operations building, the faint hum of radio equipment drifting behind him. The next chapters of the war would be written elsewhere. But this one, this war of beams, had found its end.